Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you are well. Wanted to go over a personal story that my good research assistant Josh pulled up today from Australia, because we can sit here and look at statistics and look at headlines all we want. But at the end of the day, I think what really sends the message is reading the story of individuals who are actually living through this nightmare that is Australia. And when I'm referring to Australia, more specifically, the east coast of Australia, where the states where Sydney and Melbourne, Perth is, I guess, back to quote unquote normal. But I mean, a lot of Australians push back there, but I still think even Perth, they're not allowed to leave the country. So they say, yeah, it's not a police state here in Perth because the bars are open, the restaurants are open. Uh, okay, but the bars and restaurants were open in East Germany as well, weren't they? I mean, it's not like in East Germany during the Berlin Wall. It's not like they locked you in the house. No, you could go to a restaurant, I'm sure. You could go to a bar and have a beer. I'm sure they had bars back then, especially in Germany. Uh, but you couldn't leave, you couldn't go anywhere. And so, are Australians, do you really want to claim that you are truly free when the government won't let you leave the country? See, for me, that would be the biggest red flag I have ever seen in my whole entire life. That would be such a massive red flag that I'm only allowed to leave the country if given permission. That's, boy, you want to talk about crossing a line in the sand. But let's get into this personal story and analyze it a little bit further. And I want to be clear that this person who is telling this story, this is in USA Today, I believe. And it's not like this person is a diehard libertarian. This is not a story from Tom Woods or Ron Paul by any stretch of the imagination. It sounds like this is just a mainstream normie that would be your average CNN type of viewer. But the big mistake they make is they assume that in order to get better government, we just need better people making smarter decisions. And what they don't realize is that you need smaller government. And they also make the mistake of believing that what is happening right now in Australia is just merely a snapshot. And the only direction that they'll be headed is back to the quote unquote normal of 2019. He never considers, not once, that this could be just the beginning of the totalitarian story in Australia. But let's dive into the article. You guys will see what I mean. So here we go from USA Today. What does the extreme cerveza sickness lockdown in Australia really look like? He says, my family is living it. So he starts by saying that the view most Americans have is more of a caricature of what's happening in Australia. It's really kind of some of it is fake news. He says a lot of it is accurate. And he goes into the accuracy, or what it is and isn't accuracy, and then his personal story. But one thing that he kind of dismisses is the fact that the military, the National Guard, was called in to really subdue the protests and the people, or enforce the rules that people aren't allowed to leave their house for more than an hour a day. And he says, well, in the United States, that might be a big deal, but in Australia, that's not really a big deal because we don't really see the military people as authority figures. Again, I don't care how buddy you are with the National Guard, or I don't care if the general population there sees them as just some sort of, kids that are volunteering and they don't really listen to them that much. That may be fine, but those kids have guns and you don't. And I would, at least I assume they have guns. Maybe I'm wrong. But I would assume that any military outfit in Australia has, uh, a gun, they have ammunition, they have, let's say, weapons that you do not have. And that's how they keep you in line. And I think that's a slippery slope right there. That it may be true that Australians don't really see them as authority figures, but is it safe to assume that they won't be the authority figures of the future? I think that's a little bit of a stretch. But now he goes into the personal story and giving his frustration on the basically the police state nature that at least New South Wales has turned into. So his wife is Mexican. Earlier this year, she flew with 3 of our children, all under 5, to Mexico for 3 months to attend to family health issue. We were fortunate for them to be able to leave in the first place and then make it back at all. So let me read that again. We were fortunate for them to be able to leave in the first place. Is that something you say about a free country where supposedly the people, the citizens of that country are free to make their own decisions and do what they want? Is that sound like a free country to you where you're lucky to be able to leave and go visit family members in another country? No, not to me. That sounds like that sounds like East Germany. That sounds like communist Russia. That sounds like a totalitarian police state. Let's keep going here. Last month, the Australian government cut intakes to an already restrictive border regime ahead of their departure from Mexico. On the return to Australia and 14 days mandated quarantine, our 4-year-old was taken alone in a separate ambulance because he had a cough. Like that in and of itself, you've got to think about the severity of what we're dealing with here. And I'm not here to say that the cerveza sickness is the flu or it doesn't exist, but it's not brain cancer. We have to realize that. And I don't know if you guys follow me on Twitter, but the other day I posted a poll that Bill Maher used on his show, and I believe it was from the New York Times. And this poll showed, it broke it down by, I believe, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So let's just assume that the average Democrat is the average CNN viewer, right? They asked them what they thought the probability was that if you got the cerveza sickness, you would need to be hospitalized. 41%, 41% of Democrats polled, and this is a New York Times poll, by the way, said that they thought there was a 50% chance or more that if you got the cerveza sickness, you would need to be hospitalized. 50% or more. I mean, is it any surprise that people are walking around on the sidewalk with no one else within 500 square yards and they're wearing 5 masks? Or is it any surprise that those people are driving a car by themselves and they're all masked up? I mean, not really. When we see what the media is doing to try to make them believe that the cerveza sickness is 1,000 times worse than it really is. And again, I'm not saying that it's the flu. I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm not saying it's something you want to get. I'm not saying that it isn't severe. But again, it is not brain cancer. And it's not at the level of 50% of the people who come down with it need to go to the hospital. Not even close. In fact, the actual number was 1 to 3%. And that's all age groups. That's including everyone, even people that weigh 400 pounds in the United States. If you broke that down by people under 50 who are healthy, I mean, you're just dealing with a less than 1% most likely would need to be hospitalized. So again, this is when you believe the cerveza sickness is brain cancer, then it leads you to do these things that are completely irrational and just utterly ridiculous, that have long-term damage, psychological damage to kids. I mean, you're taking a 4-year-old away from their parents in a completely separate ambulance. That 4-year-old doesn't know what the hell is going on. They don't know. They have no clue. For all they know, they're not going to see their parents again. I mean, that's a traumatic experience. But let's keep going here. Their luggage was misplaced during the transit, leaving them without luggage for 2 days. A long time with 3 young kids. During quarantine, they were checked in on multiple times a day, often late at night when asleep. Does this sound like a free country to you? I mean, think about that. You're in quarantine with your 3 young kids, and you've got someone from the military, most likely, tapping on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning just to make sure that you didn't sneak out for an hour and take a walk, because you would really be a danger to society. I mean, that's what a free country looks like? No, that's what a totalitarian police state looks like. And what's shocking is a lot of the Australians, they just don't see it. It's right in front of their face, and they don't see the frog being boiled in real time. And what's even more shocking is there's Americans and Europeans and Russians and Chinese and everyone else in the world that's not paying attention to what's going on in Australia and realizing that it could happen to them next. That's one of the main points here. Let's keep going. Certain kitchen utensils were forbidden and the oven disabled. Let's rewind here, because I know that this is hard to even comprehend that this is real. 14 days in quarantine. 4-year-old, separate ambulance. They lose the luggage. They check in on these people multiple times a day, even in the middle of the night with 3 young kids, to make sure they haven't disobeyed Big Brother and stepped outside just to get some fresh air for 5 minutes. They took away certain kitchen utensils. Why? What? I mean, I got nothing for that. I got nothing. They're forbidden to even use the stove or the oven. Then he goes on, and rightfully so, I think uses a little sarcasm. Was she presumed psychotic or at risk of the cerveza sickness? The lines between caution, theater, and incompetence ran thin. And that is where I definitely agree with this gentleman. On the last few days, the nurses caught my wife with a cough. They tested her several times, each time negative. On August 2nd, the day of her expected discharge, bags packed, kids ready to go, they were not discharged. They had to wait for another test result. Same day, test results were available elsewhere, but not at the quarantined facilities, apparently. At this point, he says they were angry. Jeez. They got a lot more patience than I do, because I would have been, they were there for 14 days. I would have had smoke coming out of my ears after about 14 minutes of this nonsense. On what basis could they continue to hold her following several negative tests? Yeah, isn't that just insane? It's not like you get tested yesterday and all of a sudden you've got it today when you were in quarantine, and they won't even let you have a knife, or they won't even let you have a fork. I mean, come on. Is this really, is this paying attention to science right here? For all of you CNN viewers out there, is this following the science, according to you? They were provided with no, what information did they have that we didn't? Could they ask for new tests indefinitely? We were provided with no information. More days or another 14-day stint was the worst case scenario we feared. Oh, no, 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 no. That's my friend, whoever wrote this, that's not the worst case scenario. That is one of the best case scenarios. What you need to do is you need to read history. And then you're going to know what the worst case scenario is right here. Her test results came back negative again, but the paperwork for discharge delayed. Apparently, emails were down. Bureaucracy turned farce. I called ministers, health officials, and arrived at the facilities to demand discharge. Frontline staff, whether security officials, nurses, facility operation managers, ministry official staffers, were universally lovely and sympathetic. They're not that lovely, dude. They've got you locked in, your family in jail. Let's not forget that. They're beating on their door at 3 o'clock in the morning. They won't let you have a knife or a fork. They won't let you use the microwave to heat up a Hot Pocket. They're not that lovely. At the very best, they're useful idiots. But it was impossible for me to reach a decision maker. I ran into contours of the machine, continuous and lumbering, immune to pleas, to reason, to appeal, all process, no responsibility. Of course, it wouldn't work for the health minister to answer every concerned father's call. No, it wouldn't. But what it would maybe be beneficial is to actually let you guys make your own decisions. Novel idea. I know. Novel idea. And of course, the pushback is, oh, well, my goodness, if we gave people freedom, their inalienable rights, then they would do stupid things. And now all of a sudden we would have all these cases and all of these deaths as a result of the cerveza sickness. I got news for you, Australia. You're going to get them. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable. Because all of these magical medicines that we have, they don't do one thing, and that's prevent transmission. And if they don't prevent transmission to the point of reducing the R0 value down below 1, then you're going to be stuck with the cerveza sickness forever. And it gets to the point where everyone in the population at some point in time will get it. So what you're doing is just delaying the inevitable. You're not fixing the problem. And on that note, I think that we should start measuring the cerveza sickness statistics in years lost, not lives lost. You see, let me illustrate what I'm referring to, because this puts things really into context and shows how insane this idea is, that if we just lock people down for years on end, and if we just turn the Australia into a totalitarian police state, the benefit is we will save lives. That's utterly ridiculous. Here's why. Go to my Twitter feed. And here's where I say, let's look at the cerveza sickness Australia in years lost again. So if they had a similar death rate to the United States, they meaning Australia, they would have approximately 50,000 deaths. Well, we can see from this statistic that the average age of death from the cerveza sickness in Australia is about 82 years. So let's just give those 82-year-olds the benefit of the doubt and assume that all of them had an average, or let's say that all of them had 5 years left to live when they passed away. So if you had 50,000 people lose 5 years of life because they died 5 years prematurely, let's assume, that would be 250,000 years lost as a result of, let's say, Australians having the same level of freedom that they have in Florida or in Texas or in Arizona. But you have to ask yourself, how many years have been lost as a result of lockdowns? Because if you went to prison for a year, would you consider that a year of your life lost? I think so. So a lot of these people in Australia have been in prison in their own house, in their quarantine, dealing with an inept government that is controlling more and more of your life. Well, that's a year lost. Ask the local 4-year-old in New South Wales if they lost a year of their life. Remember, go back to when you were 4 years old. Think about if you weren't able to leave the house for the entirety of your 4th year of life, other than an hour a day. You couldn't go to a playground. You couldn't visit your friends. The only thing you could do is sit there and play computer games. Now, that's taking a year of life away from a child that they will never, ever, 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 ever get back. So let's just assume that you took 1 year of life away from half the Australian population as a result of these draconian lockdowns, which may lead to Australia becoming the new East Germany. But let's just bench that unintended consequence or possibility of knock-on effect just for a moment. So if there's 25 million people in Australia and 12.5 million of them lose 1 year of life, that's 12.5 million years lost as a result of these lockdowns. So what they're doing is they're trading 12.5 million years to save 250,000. And oh, by the way, of those 250,000 years you're saving with those people that are 82 years old, they're in lockdown as well. So it's not like they're living. And I went on to tweet that we have to remember that just because you're alive doesn't mean that you are living. And that's something that is completely lost on most individuals, your average CNN viewer, when they're discussing, or even, I'm not going to say they're even thinking about it, but they're feeling about what's going on with the cerveza sickness. And one more point there is that those 12.5 million years that have been lost, a lot of that is with young people, like the example, the 4-year-old that I gave earlier. So effectively what they're doing is they're stealing years away from young people and giving them to old people. How does that make any sense in the world? And this goes back to what I'm saying with the level of insanity in Australia, and then also highlighting the fact that if you just do a cost benefit analysis, just do a simple cost benefit analysis where you just think about it at a level beyond a 3rd grader, and you come to the same conclusion every time. It's a no-brainer that none of this makes sense at all. None of it. So then that goes back to, is it really about health? I don't think it's about health here in the United States. And honestly, I don't think it's about health in Australia either. But let's go back to the personal story from these people. So now he goes, let's see what happened. How did they conclude? Of course, it would work. The health minister, conservative fathers called. Yeah, we suffered only 14 hours. See, and isn't he giving them too much credit? We suffered only 14 hours. Like he's like, oh, thank you, government. Thank you, health minister. Thank you, all you kind people. You've locked me in a cage for 14 days. You wouldn't let me use the microwave to heat up a hot pocket. You were checking on me at in 3 o'clock in the morning, just in case I went outside for 5 minutes. And you did that for 14 days of my life that I will never, ever get back. But thank you so much for only keeping me another 14 hours above and beyond the 14 days. Like, I don't understand how people can have that attitude. Like how about saying F you to every single person involved? How about being outraged to the point of saying, you know what, I'm taking the next flight out of this country and I'm never coming back. But that would mean that you'd actually be able to leave the country. You'd be free to leave the country. And right now, they're not even free to leave. But he says it was enough of a glimpse. See, it was enough to glimpse the infuriating impersonal interactions of those who really fall under the grinding gears of state bureaucracy. And again, my friend, whomever wrote this, I get it. I understand your frustration with bureaucracy. Hopefully, this opens your eyes up to the inefficiencies of government. But believe me, my friend, this is not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is not bureaucracy and just making this process more efficient. Your problem is that now the government knows they can do this to you whenever they want. And when a government takes power, they very rarely ever give it back. You're not going back to 2019 in Australia. I can tell you that right now. That life is over and done with. I think the best thing that they could hope for right now is that at some point in time, they get to a level of being a California or a New York City or something like that. They're not going back to 2019. And I think that's best case scenario. I think a more probable scenario is that they continue to micromanage the lives of Australians. And I think the very next thing they roll out there are lockdowns for climate change. Like, why wouldn't they do that? Like, they've already conditioned you guys to accept being locked in a cage and only let out for an hour a day. And if people are willing to do that in the name of health and safety, why wouldn't they be willing to do that for 10 years, for 20 years, for the rest of their lives in the name of battling climate change for future generations? I mean, you can see the argument now. And I think for a lot of people, they would buy into it. And that goes back to just not only cooking the frog slowly, but it goes back to this psychological theory that I've been talking about a lot, the foot in the front door theory. I've talked about it on whiteboard videos. I've talked about it on this channel. And just quickly, basically what that states is that if you ask someone to do something small and they agree to it, the probability that they agree to do something the probability that they agree to a much larger request is significantly higher, meaning that it goes from like 20% up to 70 or 80%. And whether the Australian government and the US government, governments around the world, whether this has been intentional or whether it's unintentional, the net result is still the same. And that's 2020, and what we're experiencing now in 2021 has conditioned people to be far more receptive to the next big or bigger request that the government has. And I hope I'm wrong. Again, there are absolutely no certainties, only probabilities. And that's one of the reasons why I've been so aggressive on creating content for this channel, because I want to get the word out. I want to open up people's eyes. I want to show them the dangers of giving government too much power and restricting your freedom and liberty. I want to stand up and fight for freedom. But we have to understand that we could be on a path where these lockdowns are something that are just a part of life, and that the majority of the population just go right along with it. So here's where he talks about exit from Australia being banned. And just in case you thought I was making that up, it's this guy is saying it. I'm not saying that. Let's read. Australians have been banned from leaving the country. Pretty straightforward. A unique step in the world. To someone born in the Soviet Union like me, this is shocking. And what's even more shocking to me is that it isn't shocking to the majority of Australians or Americans for that matter, or anyone in the world. How can you not look at Australia, what they're doing, and be like, whoa, 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 time out here. This is way too close to Stalinist Russia. This is way, way, way too close to Germany in the 1930s or East Germany. That's what's really shocking to me. You may leave, but you must apply for an exemption and describe your emergency. Hey, I've got it. My emergency is that my government is a psychotic authoritarian that's pushing more and more towards a totalitarian police state. And I got to get the hell out of here before it's too late. That's my emergency, Mr. Government. How's that sound? The nation where almost a third of the residents are born overseas, this has had real consequences for Australian families. Elderly parents left to die alone, newborns separated from their parents. Dedicated Facebook groups record endless such stories pleading for help. Remarkably, the government is only tightening the screws. Does that sound like a free country to you? I don't care what type of cerveza sickness you're dealing with. This is unexcusable. It's unprecedented. And I think the Australians and everyone else in the world should be watching this in horror as to this could be something we look back on in 30 and 40 years, just like we look back on what happened with East Germany, or maybe even worse. Who knows? So now he talks about the success of Australia. And this goes back to what I was saying before, that it is true. Australia has suffered fewer than 1,000 deaths today compared to over 600,000 in the US. Now, of course, that's a little disingenuous because the US has 350 million people and Australia has 25 million. So, but apples to apples, based on my back of the napkin math, it would still be about 50,000. So you could say, okay, well, we've saved 49,000 lives, and that's worth basically turning the country into a totalitarian police state. But that's if you look at deaths. And I think you've got to look at years lost, not lives lost. And when you look at years lost, it paints a completely different picture, which I think is far more accurate. And here's where he just goes off the deep end. And I'm going to read this because it just shows you that people, if they haven't studied enough history, and you would think that this guy would know, being from what he claims is communist Russia. I'm assuming he lived there back in those times. You would assume that he would have a little bit better idea of the downside of all of this, but I guess not. It's shocking, but here we go. No quarantine facilities were built. There was no rush to get the medicine. Leaders played up fears around AstraZeneca, fostering community hesitancy, then lost credibility as they flip-flopped. Well, I definitely agree with him there. Absolutely. And this is, but see, to me, when I see the institutions and the political leaders contradict themselves, my first impression is that there's something else going on and that I should not trust them any further. But see, he doesn't come to that conclusion. He just comes to the conclusion that, well, they just made a couple mistakes, but I'm sure their intentions are good, and they still have the society, the security, the safety, the health of society as their number one priority. They just made some goofy mistakes, and they should have created a police state, but they should have just done it a little bit different way that would have been more efficient. That's like the conclusion that he comes to, which is, I just don't see how you draw that conclusion if these people lie to you and contradict themselves constantly. At what point does it become Stockholm syndrome, right? Where the person who is kidnapped starts buying everything, or buying into and trusting and having some sort of bizarre emotional connection to the person that kidnapped them in the first place. Because that's what this sounds like to me. So he says it's inexcusable that 18 months since the pervasive sickness began, we still have inefficient quarantine capacity. See, let's just turn this into a. So what he's saying is they turned it into a police state, but they just, which isn't bad, they just turned it into the wrong type of police state. These failures have meant that our federal government and state governments must rely on harsh, closed border and lockdown policies. So I don't want to throw this guy under the bus. Obviously, he's dealing with a lot of challenges in Australia that I feel really sorry for him and his family. But I wanted to go over that story to open your eyes as to where this can lead right here in the United States. I mean, if you would have gone back to 2019 and asked people, is Australia as free as the United States? And you might get some people that say, oh, no, because they don't allow them to have guns. Okay, fine. But I'm talking about the average American, the average CNN viewer. They would have said, absolutely, Australia is a wonderful place to live. And if you would have brought up this topic, if you would have said, okay, what is the likelihood of Australia turning into a totalitarian police state? They would have said zero, absolutely zero. Just like for a lot of Americans out there, if you ask them, hey, what are the probabilities that the United States turns into New South Wales? They'd say the same thing, zero. Well, my whole point is it wasn't zero. The probability was far greater than that. So anyone that thinks that this cannot happen in their country, in their state, in their city, in my opinion, is just whistling by the graveyard. And it is true that in some states, some cities, some jurisdictions, the probability is lower or higher, but still the probability is far greater than zero.